Well, hello. This is a special recorded conversation. Chris and I are joined by Richard Macfarlane out of the UK. Richard, maybe you can introduce yourself and some of your professional credentials and where it is you work or who you're representing today.
Hello, yes, I'm Richard Macfarlane. I'm the museums manager for Calderdale Museums in Halifax. That's Halifax in Yorkshire, the original, not the copy. We are based in the north of England, in the Pennines, so in Yorkshire, God's own country. It's a beautiful part of the world. The We have a collection of museums. There's Bankfield Museum in Halifax, which is a local museum, local history, art, costume and textile, all the things you'd expect in a local museum. It also houses the Duke of Wellington's Regimental Museum with the collection from that regiment. We have Shibden Hall in Halifax also. That's the home of Anne Lister, who has recently been made famous by the BBC television production of Gentleman Jack. And we have the Smith Art Gallery in Brighouse, which is the art gallery for Calderdale. Calderdale's a local authority, so it's local council run and managed. I manage all of those museums, and I think the one we're mostly interested in from the history side of thing is probably Bankfield Museum.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the record, my mother-in-law is from Yorkshire, so I have a connection. I think I first met you guys in 2012 at Cardiff Castle, and then
Yes,
the late
yes.
night tavern. You guys were singing. Was it on Ickley Moor or something?
Yes, the national anthem of Yorkshire.
Yeah,
Ilty More about that.
I was telling
Um,
my mother-in-law about that, and she said, "How on earth did you hear that?" So, but all right, let's get back on track here. Sorry. See, but I told you we waffle too, so there's
well,
no.
that's fine. I also reenact, and I reenact the 33rd Foot from the Waterloo period, late Georgian. And that is the regiment that became the Duke of Wellington's regiment, hence the connection to the museum.
Yeah, and then if we give everyone some context, at Waterloo 2015, and the Canadian battalion brigaded with the 33rd, and I think
Yeah.
Coldstream, and then a smattering of 95th. So what I like about the 33rd, having come up through the 41st, is the red facings and
Mhm.
it's you blur your eyes, and we could say like we're all one big
And
happy
Bastion
unit.
loops, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. I guess what caught my eye is an exhibit you currently have going on, and that's called Inspired, the Art of Making Historical Fashion. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the a little bit of background to it. Being set in Halifax in Yorkshire, when the museum, which was set up in 1887, was first starting up and up to around the turn of the century, the previous one. Um, the curator at the time, a chap called Henry Lingroth, he looked at the local museum as a way of bringing the world to Halifax, but also what Halifax had done for the world. And Halifax and West Yorkshire is built on textiles and textile production. So he started collecting anything and everything to do with textile and textile production to see how Halifax had exported predominantly woolen cloth around the world. But also he reversed that and he saw how world cloth production had actually influenced Halifax. So we've got a very good ethnographic collection, and it's everything to do with textile production from the various fiber types, obviously mostly wool, but there's carding and combing and spinning and weaving and dyeing and finishing. And then, of course, the uses for textile. Halifax was a major carpet production area. It was a major area for producing maquette. That's the stuff you get on bus seats. And the obviously another major use of the cloth is in clothing. So we've got a very good costume and textile collection at Bankfield. We've got over 17,000 items in that collection, with a very good representation of historical clothing from various periods. As with most costume collections, it's predominantly female because that's what tends to survive. And it's we've got some early items like mummy wrappings and other textile samples, but until you get to the 18th century, you don't start getting much in the way of garments. Then, of course, there's lots of Victorian and 20th century items right the way through the 20th century. So on that basis of that being our sort of forte for the museum, we created a few years ago on one of the floors at the museum what we call the Fashion Gallery. And in this, we've done various exhibitions relating to fashion and costume. And the one we decided to put on for 2024 is called Inspired, the Art of Making Historical Costume. It's part of an Arts and Humanities Research Council project looking at how you actually go about creating a costume exhibition and displaying it. The idea being that with museums these days, with reductions in funding, there are fewer and fewer specialists. So whereas in the past, most museums would have a costume and textile specialist, very few places actually have that now. And curators are expected to be a lot more generic and cover everything from social history to art to industrial to military, costume and textile, and just do everything. But they don't necessarily have that strength and background in costume and textile. So this project is about creating some resources to help curators out as to how you would go about doing a costume and textile exhibition, and specifically in displaying and exhibiting costume. So what we wanted to do with this exhibition was also explore, why do we have a costume collection in the museum? As with most collections in museums, 90% of it is always in store, and only about 10% tends to be on display at any one time. So there's often that challenge as to, well, why have you got the rest of it? It all needs taking care of and looking after. Costume is particularly vulnerable to light and pests and humidity and things like that. So it's quite a task to look after 17,000 items of it. So why do we have it? What's the point in keeping it if it's not going to be displayed? And some of it is in fairly poor condition, so it wouldn't even display very well anyway. You couldn't put it on a mannequin, and you couldn't really show it because you'd be damaging the item to do so. So it spends most of its time in boxes in a store. And we wanted to get across why we have that and who uses it. So this exhibition is about people who come and work with our costume collection and research it. And then they go away and they make costume based upon it. Now, at one end of the scale, we have those who do very accurate research, and they want to recreate the costume in, oh, sorry, my cat wrangler is not doing her job. Can you shut her out? Yes. Sorry about that. Yes, I'll start that bit again. At one end of the scale, we've got those people who want to do almost stitch by stitch reproductions of original costume. They want to try and get the material as accurate as possible, even down to the sort of pick count and the weight and the feel of it, so it drapes and it behaves in the same way as the originals. You then get a sort of sliding scale, and you go through things like film and TV costume. Now, we worked with Tom Pye, who was the costume person for Gentleman Jack. He came and looked at our costume, and he then went and did the costume design for Gentleman Jack. But with film and TV costume, often they are embellishing things, making them a little bit larger than life, the same as they do with the script and the lighting and the cameras and everything else. They want it to be a little bit more than it was. If you've seen Gentleman Jack, you'll see Anne Lister wearing a top hat. There's no evidence she ever wore a top hat, but that has become an icon for Anne Lister, and in representing her masculinity. And as people have latched onto it, and it was a brilliant piece of costume design in coming up with that look for her, and the combination of masculine and feminine clothes. So she wears waistcoats and pocket watches and things like that. In making film and TV costume, you'll also get that they sometimes cut corners. So where it's not seen, you'll see modern fastenings. And makes it a little bit easier for actors and actresses to get in and out of the costume. But then there's also people who use costume just as simply as inspiration. Very obvious examples of people like steampunk and things like that, where it's based on historical costume, but it's not necessarily looking to do an accurate reproduction of it. It's just using the style and the influence for it. So it's a form of cosplay, really, and that's a lot different from what a lot of reenactors tend to do, because they're trying to recreate a particular look, a particular uniform from a particular period, and they want everything to be correct to that period. Whereas people like steampunk will happily mash things up from all sorts of different periods. We've also got we worked with a lady whose company is White Phantom, and she does corsetry. So it's based on original corsetry, but she does these wonderful fantasy designs. And she's done things like high-vis corsets. So she's actually used high-vis material. She's got these bright yellow corsets made out of high-vis stuff. And in the exhibition, she's got a lovely sort of devil and an angel version with wings on the back and all sorts of fantasy elements and things like that. So all sorts of people want to come and look at costume collections and be inspired by it. You also have modern costume designers, people making stuff for the catwalk. And our previous exhibitions have included some of their items, but they're often influenced by historical fashions as well. And sometimes they will just simply look through books and other things, but a lot of them do like to look at the originals to see how they're constructed, see what sort of materials they use, and take inspiration from that. So museum costume collections get used by all sorts of people, and all of those uses are equally valid in their own right. So we as a museum try to give as much access as possible to people to come and research our collections and then to use it in any way they want. Part of what we want with the Inspired exhibition is to inspire people. So one of our objectives was that people would come to the exhibition and see it, and they would be inspired to go away and make things themselves. And what a lot of the makers who we interviewed has said was, for people who shouldn't be afraid of actually going out and trying it. Everybody, when they first start out, they make mistakes, they get things wrong, they're not necessarily very good at it. Nobody is. It's not a natural talent necessarily to be able to make historical costume. But over time, you get better, you learn about it, you do more research, you talk to other people who are making it, you find different suppliers of material that will work better for you. And you end up making a better product yourself. So one of the messages is to go out and have a go and try and make things for yourself. As a reenactor of a certain age, Tom, you will remember that the time long before you could simply go on the internet and find somebody else's research on all the material. You had to go and do it yourself. And also there are suppliers out there now who are making all the stuff, and you can simply send off for it and get stuff sent through the post to you. Previously, it was a case of going out and you had to have a go at making it yourself because these things just weren't available. So most reenactors were also makers at some level, and having to make things for themselves, whether it was leather work or clothing or and all sorts of bits and pieces. So
Yeah, yeah, we had I don't know if you could say passed along or constantly recreated like patterns. I think Parks Canada had
yeah,
had either they found a pattern or maybe they have from an original coat, they created a pattern, and then I don't know how many reenactors hands that passed through, like where they
mhm,
would trace it out, give it back to whoever held
yeah,
that copy of it, and then but then yeah, like you said, practice makes perfect. Some of them trying to adjust the size, then things
mhm,
would go hideously wrong as they try to make it
yes.
bigger or
Try and
smaller.
make a modern fit. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but
Also, sometimes the people doing the making, they're schooled in making modern garments. So just one very obvious thing that you see is shoulder seams in the wrong place. A modern jacket will have a shoulder seam uh, in line with the end of the shoulder, whereas most Georgian stuff, the actual shoulder seam comes to the point of the shoulder, so it comes much higher on the shoulder. And if you get that correct, then you notice the fit of the coat becomes so much better and it looks more period. But it's learning about things like that and sometimes not understanding why things don't look quite right for the period. You look at old films and yeah, it's particularly stuff from the sort of 1940s and things, and they're way off on their patterns. Um, but now with being able to share research a lot more, then I think people can get it a lot more accurate.
well, there's creating the garments, but then also schooling people on how to wear them too. Like I know for a
Yes.
while, Chris was doing a thread on
Mhm.
Twitter going through some different period films and that, and then criticizing, some of
Mhm.
the way stuff was worn or how it was constructed. So
Yeah.
I'll readily admit I make very little. I can wield my visa with the best of them, but then my co-host Chris is quite an adept sewer. So Chris, I think you make
Mhm.
all your own coats and uniforms, right? And then I think your wife's
Yes,
dress.
yes. I've made most of mine, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I do work with people also to make outfits and yeah.
I was gonna jump in and ask Richard how much experience you had in that. If that was a personal story where you started out with not
It
knowing, not having patterns and having to try it yourself. Is that where
it
you
is.
started?
I've let me think, how many years is it now? 41 years of reenacting.
Wow.
I started when I was 17, and you can do the maths on that yourself. The Between my A levels and going off to university, I had a year, and I was fortunate to work with somebody who had their own little business making uniforms and stuff, mostly for reenactors at the time. And because at that age you don't have any money, I could then make some of my own things and made a couple of uniforms. Started off with American Civil War, interestingly enough, and because that was a popular period at the time. So I made some uniforms for that, which wouldn't pass these days, but were like very good at the time, using as close as we could get to the correct materials and using patterns that were taken off originals and things like that. Whereas a lot of people were still just converting pajama patterns and all sorts of weird things to make their outfits back then. Um, I then came, I worked after university. I worked at a gentleman's outfitters for about 3 years. So, in terms of measuring people and learning about clothes, that became part of my knowledge. And all the time, I was still making uniforms and things for myself. And of course, if you're in reenactment and you're making uniforms, and people know that you're making uniforms, oh, can you make me one? So I'd made a couple of things for other people. And then it would be about 1997, 96, 97. I actually started up my own business making historical costume. So that was researching and creating costume largely for reenactors and museums, and it was historical stuff. So I did a little bit for some film and other things, but it was at the same time I was moving into museums, and then around about 2000, I got a full-time job in museums, so I had to kind of pack in the business. It was one or the other. And as a lot of makers find out, you can't actually make a very good living out of it, because hand sewing stuff takes a long time and people don't like paying the money. I think that's probably got better these days. It's more accepted what the real cost of making things is. But so I stopped making for other people at that point, but I do still make things for myself. And it's more hobby and pleasure rather than working to deadlines and having to churn out half a dozen uniforms for a unit or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I mean, Tom and I have certainly seen your work on the internet and that sort of thing, you know, in your uniform. But no, I'm very much the same way. I've made here and there for other people, but it takes the joy out of it when there's a deadline and, you know, somebody's expecting, and I would much rather make things for myself. And the other thing I say to people is, I don't have any tailoring experience. So you talked about working in a clothier shop, but I don't have any of that. So I sort of say, as long as you want a 38 tall, I'm happy to make it for you. But as soon as you need a different size, you need to call an expert. So
the further you get away from that, the more things start to stretch in odd directions. So yes, I have made for things up to about 54 chest, 54 waist. But the cut and shape becomes totally different. I've also made some women's clothing as well. And women are obviously a very different shape. But the approach to women's clothing at the time was different as well. They used a lot more draping and a lot less measuring. So things are put onto the body and fitted, rather than a lot of the male way of doing it is by using either parchment strips, which were marked and cut to size, or when they became available, tape measures, and drafting patterns. Then there's all these weird and wonderful systems for how to draft a pattern, for taking all the measurements and everything, but then how to do all the corrections for if somebody's got a drop right shoulder or long neck or sloping shoulders, or if they're portly or stout, or so it does become quite a skill to be able to look at people and figure out how a three-dimensional object is going to be covered with a two-dimensional pattern. Interestingly, we've got an example of that in the Inspired exhibition, because obviously I was involved in working with it. I worked with somebody to get some pattern pieces. So we've actually got like a set of Georgian pattern pieces for a coat, but also a sort of mid-20th century, 1930s, 1940s jacket. So you can see that the seams are in completely different places. And these pieces actually, they Velcro together. They've got little tabs on them and you can Velcro them. And then we then drape them onto a mannequin. So you can see how the flat two-dimensional shapes come together to form that 3D object that is a man's coat or jacket. And it's a little bit of an interactive thing, because one thing we wanted with the exhibition was to inspire people to get involved and get their hands on things. So there's another section of it where you're encouraged to draw a dress. And it's sort of doing like fashion design in reverse, and that you've already got the dress and you're drawing it, as opposed to drawing a fashion design and then making a dress from it. But there's another piece where we've got there's a dress in a flatbed case, which is a lovely old silk Victorian dress. But it's far too fragile because the silk is shattered to actually be put on a mannequin. So it's just laid flat. But you can look down into the case and we've blown up little sections of it so you can see the details of the fastenings and the detail of a pocket that's in it. And we've also then got a reproduction that one of the ladies we work with, Gabby Monet, who makes a lot of reproduction stuff in this country. She's done a recreation of this dress in a similar sort of light blue silk. And the original one had swan's down trim to it, and she managed to find something that replicated this look of swan's down. And recreate that. So we've got that on a mannequin in a display case alongside, so you can compare that this is what somebody's researched and this is what somebody's produced from it, and you can see the pattern that she's taken from it and what it then looks like in real life. And that is another reason for reproducing historical items, because they can then be used. Museum collections, we don't allow people to try them on and wear them for obvious reasons. But I sometimes compare that to it's a bit like seeing a stuffed polar bear. In that yes, that's a polar bear and it's very impressive, but it just stands there. It doesn't do anything. If you go and see a polar bear at the zoo, then you can see it moving around. It's still not in its natural habitat. And ultimately, the great thing to be able to do would be go and see a polar bear up at the North Pole, which indeed you may be able to do in your country, but we can't. Not many people are going to be able to do that, in the same way we can't really go back and see the original costume being worn at the time and seeing it in context. But we can, through reenactment and through recreation, see what things would actually look like and learn about how they feel, how to wear them. This is one of the great things about reenactment, it's that sort of reconstructive archaeology, is you are finding out what it felt like to wear these uniforms. I know the 41st and the 33rd have certainly done like long marches in the uniforms, and you learn about how to carry things, how the things fit, what works, what doesn't. Which was probably second nature to the people at the time, but a lot of that has been lost over time. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's the shame is a lot of the stuff like footwear from the time period, like a private soldier's footwear, like it was so common, like no one could envision it ever being of interest, like to someone in the future, right? So they were worn until they were worn out, and then probably the leather rehabilitated to be used for other stuff, and there's so many things like that.
The few surviving examples tend to be things like the Weedon Barrack boot and things like that, which are often footwear that's been found hidden away somewhere. It's fallen beneath floorboards, or it's been stuffed up chimneys and things like that. And that's how it has survived, because otherwise it's just worn to destruction.
So interesting use of your collection. How often, what's the frequency of a researcher, someone coming in to have a look at an item or go through things? And then a part two to my question, do you vet these people to make sure that they're not crackpots that might damage things? And
we don't get too many crackpots, but I suppose that depends on your definition of crackpot. Somebody who wants to spend weeks recreating a military uniform could well be described as a crackpot. But we try to give as much access as possible to as many people as want it. We're a free to enter museum, and we don't currently make a charge, particularly for researchers coming in. Now, you can normally tell who the serious researchers are and who the less serious ones are. The serious ones will come in and you will immediately see that they want to look at all the detail. They take loads and loads of photographs, drawings, notes, sketches, and they're really interested in it. Some of the other end of the scale we get is, well, I'd like to come and look through your costume collection. Yeah, certainly. What would you like to see? Victorian dresses. Can you be a bit more specific? It's everything from 1830s up to 1900. That's quite a large period. Are you looking for a particular decade or a particular type of dress, or and some? No, I'm not. I just want to see Victorian dresses. Right, okay. So you'll get out a selection of half a dozen, and what we do get quite a few, like Women's Institute and knit and stitch groups and things like that. And they will want to come, and part of it is they just want an entertaining day of looking at something from our costume and textile collection. So often it might be something like embroidery or needlework and that side of things that they're looking at. But everybody loves to see costume as well, and we've got stuff from all over the world. We've got a very good Balkan collection that was collected by Edith Durham and has been added to since. So that's Eastern European. We've got stuff from Africa. We've got ancient Peruvian textiles. So it depends what people are coming to look for. Also, people might be looking at quilting or particular techniques and things. So that was part of your question. What was the other part of the question?
No, I think you got it all. I think I asked about the frequency of use.
Oh yeah. It's year round, really. You can never predict what you're going to get. Sometimes when we advertise or do something like this exhibition, then it does generate more interest and more inquiries about particular items. Some people want to see a particular item, like we've got one of the Duke of Wellington's coats. So they might specifically want to come in and see that, or they might ask, have you got 18th century waistcoats or something like that in your collection? And we can say what we have or what we haven't got. We've got the Thomas Coutts clothing. I'm focusing very much on male clothing here, but I suppose it feels like a male conversation.
But our audience isn't, so
I'll cover all sorts then. The costume collections do tend to focus on female costume, and one of the things I'm always challenging is try to redress some of that balance and make sure that we include male costume in the exhibitions. And the exhibition we've got at the moment has got some excellent Regency reproduced costume. And some wonderful wartime reproduction of men's clothing. But we also have lovely 1940s, 1930s women's reproduction clothing in there. And of course, 19th century clothing as well. But I was saying about Thomas Coutts, we've got he was the banker to royalty in the early 19th century. And his collection was donated to the V&A and was then split up and sent to various costume museums around the country. We were fortunate enough to get one of those things. So we've got one of his coats that he being a fairly typical man, he had half a dozen coats. They were all black and all very, very similar cut and style. We've got one of those in the collection, but we've also got shirts and underwear, and very rare survival, we've actually got legwear underwear, which is very rare to survive from that period. So people are very interested in looking at those sorts of items and studying them in detail. So people may be coming for specific items, or they may be coming for sort of general research purposes. We've also got masses of pattern books, cloth samples. We do have patterns themselves. Obviously later ones when patterns became available. We've got sewing patterns, knitting patterns, tailor's books, all sorts of things in the collection, even dye samples and things like that we've got examples of.
So do you have Chris can correct me if I don't get this right, the Pierce Taylor book?
We haven't got one of those, no. Canada has.
I had the good fortune to hold one. There's one in the collection at the Canadian War Museum. So it's
Yes, we've got photographs of the relevant pages from it that we've had before. Has that now been digitized? Is that available online? Do you know? Or
I don't know. When I saw it, they didn't let me take my own photographs. And they said that they would photograph the page I wanted, and then I've heard there was a cost associated to it. So,
right.
but
Yeah.
then unfortunately, Yahoos have stolen bits of lace and stuff out of it too.
Oh, yes.
So
well,
I
unfortunately,
can,
on the page for the 33rd, there's a little section where all that's left is the glue. And it's a piece of the drummer's lace. So we've had to speculate on our drummer's uniforms as to what the lace was, but based on 53rd chevron lace and stuff like that. So yeah. So getting a bit too specific into our areas there.
so I can jump in for a second. I know that they've sort of high res image pictured all the pages. I don't believe it's online, but the last time I spoke to them at the War, they were happy to sort of email out any images, and they sort of send me dozens of PDF pages. So I don't think it's available just for download, but certainly widely distributed.
So again, for serious researchers who can bother to actually go and chase it, then it's available, and yeah, that's good.
So I know I'm thinking of something worn in a movie or something that people might have seen. What's the highest profile item that's been inspired by your collection?
Inspired by our collection.
Yeah,
I thought you were referring to recent acquisitions.
No, we'll get there. I saw the empty display waiting.
I would say probably the some of the Gentleman Jack costume for that production. There was one of the dressers for Anne Walker. Tom Pye came and went through our pattern books and liked one of the patterns, so he had that pattern recreated and a material actually printed up and made, and then made a dress out of it for Anne Walker. Sophie Rundle is the actress to wear in that production. So yes, that was quite a significant one. We have had people copy the Duke of Wellington's coat. It's a slightly later one. It's not a Waterloo period one, as is evidenced by it's got a waist seam to it. So it's more sort of 1830s onwards for when waist seams came in on gentlemen's coats to get the sort of flared skirt. We've got the Duke of Wellington's boots in our collection. That's a very significant item. From the same period, we've also got a lovely cap from the 33rd with a bullet hole in it that was received at Waterloo. And as ever with that sort of thing, you come across it and you think, yes, sure, of course it was. Somebody's put it on a post and shot it. But with this one, we've actually got the letter that goes along with it, and where the officer is writing back to his mother, and he just after Waterloo, and he says, "A ball passed through my cap, narrowly missing the top of my head. I'm thinking of bringing the cap home as a souvenir." And there in the museum is the cap with a bullet hole from Waterloo. So yeah, we've got some lovely things in museum like that. That cap has been used by reenactors for reproducing the 1812 cap, measurements of it, and that one, and looking at other ones that are in other collections like the Green Howards, surviving examples. They do tend to be officers' ones that survive, but our whole 33rd, we were lucky having the stuff that's in the museum, because the metalwork, we've got buttons and crossbelt plates and things like that we were able to copy, and the cap plate for the 1812 cap as well. So yeah.
I know, I got this memory, and maybe it's not right, but I've got a memory, I think, of you guys getting them to open one of the display cases in Cardiff at the castle because you wanted a closer look
We
at
were
some
probably,
items or take some measurements or pictures or.
yes, I do remember doing that. Yes, and it's nice when you get to a museum that are friendly enough and helpful enough to be able to do that sort of thing for you. I remember in doing research myself, a lot of military museums tended to be run by the sort of ex-military chap who had been kept on to look after the military museum. And many years ago, I went down to the Duke of Cornwall's, the 32nd museum in Bodmin in Cornwall. And I saw that in a case there, they had an original stock. And we'd been making and looking at stocks for recreating in the 33rd. And said, "Oh, I'm really interested in that. Could I possibly look at it and measure it and be able to get the pattern off it so we can recreate them?" And he said, "Sure, yeah," and just opened up the case, took it out, slapped it down onto a piece of paper and drew around it. Okay, that's one way of doing it, I suppose. I was prepared to sort of measure and carefully do it, but no, he basically just traced around it with a pencil. So we got the stock pattern.
So there's we have a video on it on our channel. There's Sir Isaac Brock had ordered a new hat, but it arrived after his death at Queenston Heights. So it's in the museum in Niagara-on-the-Lake. But there's all kinds of stories about how every year for, I don't know, a Canada Day parade or something, like the hat would be taken out and local dignitaries were wearing it in parades or in some kind of drinking festival. And then finally someone said, "You guys are ruining this artifact. Stop doing that."
Yes,
Like,
it needs to be kept in a museum. Yes, yeah.
yeah. All right. I had something else, but all right, tell us about that display case that's awaiting the arrival of
Okay, well, we've already alluded to the recent acquisitions. Now, it was it was international news. That there was an auction by Kerry Taylor Auctions earlier this year of film and TV costume by the company Cosprop. And within all that, there was one particular outfit that everybody focused on, and that was a Mr. Darcy's outfit as worn by Colin Firth from the Pride and Prejudice BBC adaptation of Jane Austen's novel. And within that particular outfit, there's one particular item of clothing that everybody focuses on, and that is the wet shirt. And it was announced on news channels all around the country that this shirt had sold for £25,000 at auction. And we were the museum that had actually managed to bid on that. For a few days, we were waiting to be able to announce that it was us because we'd been telephone bidding. So the auction, we were watching it live on a little laptop because we couldn't be in London for the actual auction. And I was bidding on the telephone. So we were that mystery person on the end of the telephone who was bidding for it. And as the amount crept up and got to £20,000, a cheer went up in the room, and that was the hammer price. The other 5,000 is the buyer's premium. But one thing with this acquisition is all the money from it went to the Bright Foundation. John Bright actually set up and created Cosprop. So he is the founder and the owner of the company. And he was doing this auction to raise money for a foundation. And it's an arts charity that helps children based in London. So the money has gone to a very good cause. People have also said, well, why are you spending my council tax on things like this? The money didn't actually come from council tax. The money was a separate pot of money we have in the museum called the Works of Art Fund. We're long gone are the days when we have purchase funds. Museums used to have big purchase funds. We certainly don't have anything like that anymore. But the Works of Art Fund is something that builds up over time from donations and bequests and money that people have gifted to the museum, or any insurance money or things like that. Then it goes into the Works of Art Fund, and that becomes available for purchases of items for the collection, or for conservation of items in the collection. Now, if we'd spent £25,000 on an oil painting, it wouldn't have hit the news. It might not even be a particularly significant oil painting at that price, because paintings go for millions. But the fact that it was a piece of costume going at that price, then that was big news. And the story did go internationally. It was in the Washington Post and Singapore Times and things like that, and all the major newspapers and media outlets in the UK as well. So yes, we were lucky enough to secure that. And I was quoted as, at the risk of sounding like Indiana Jones, saying it belongs in a museum.
I've never seen that.
The shirt itself is from the famous scene of Mr. Darcy. I'm sure most of your, if your viewers are into history, they'll probably know about Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen. But just in case any don't, Mr. Darcy, the very proud gentleman, very stiff and proper, is seen in this scene at home on his estate, where he's relaxed, he's away from public view, and he strips down to his shirt and breeches and dives into a pond for a swim on a hot day. And he emerges from the pond soaking wet with the shirt clinging to his torso. He's then walking back to the house, and he bumps into Elizabeth Bennet, who is the lady that he had previously proposed to, and she had very strongly turned down his proposal as the last man on earth she could be presumed upon to marry. But she then sees him in a completely different light, and they created this scene where there's it's not in the book. It was created by the BBC production, but the awkwardness of the two of them meeting by chance on his estate, because there's also the thing, it's on his estate, she shouldn't really be there, but she was on holiday with her aunt and uncle in Derbyshire, and she was sneaking around basically and having a look at his estate while he wasn't meant to be there, but he came back a day early, so they bump into each other in the grounds. That part is in the book. And you got this delightfully awkward scene between the two. But it's that understated way of doing it that a lot of people, particularly women, have latched onto, is the almost sort of steaminess of the scene, because there's the undertones there of the shirt clinging to his body, but him being disheveled and with his guard down. It's also the point in the book and in the adaptation where Elizabeth starts to actually completely change her opinion of Mr. Darcy, and she goes from finding him detestable to actually falling in love with him. You could say she also falls in love with his house, because he's got this lovely estate in Derbyshire, which is played by Lyme Park in this adaptation. So that was actually filmed at Lyme Park in Cheshire, which somebody has measured the distance is, I think, 46 miles away from our museum. So it's not that far away from where it was made. You can get there in just over an hour. So if people are coming and doing the Pride and Prejudice trip of England, then it's reachable from one to the other. They can look at Lyme Park and see where it was filmed, and lots of people do. Screen tourism is absolutely huge these days. They can also now come to Bankfield Museum, and as of this Saturday, the 25th of May, it will be on display for the rest of 2024. And we've got its own case ready for it. It will be going up this week, and will be available for anyone to see. As I say, it's free entry to the museum. So we're making it as accessible as possible to people to come and see that original item. Now, as a museum person, it used to quite annoy me that people would travel so far to see film and TV costume. Because we've got a storeroom full of original costume. We've got original Regency costume. We've got original shirts. We've got a lovely one in the collection, which is Joseph Bonaparte shirt. But that's a different story. I always had this slight annoyance that people were so fixated on film and TV. But I am a convert now, and I realize that that will get people in to see the museum. And whilst they're here, we can then hit them with all the original stuff that we've got alongside film and TV costume. So it is a way of getting people interested in costume, interested in historical costume. And also that shirt now is a historical item in its own right. It was filmed in 1995, so it's already quite old. But it was an iconic moment in television. It has been voted people's favorite TV moment. It's up there with the moon landing and things like that, is Mr. Darcy walking back in his wet shirt. So,
well, it's I guess that shirt can be to fashion what Richard Sharp has been to a lot of reenactors, right? The thing that's
yes,
sparked an interest and drawn us in. So yeah.
It is. It's these things, even things like, and I say even things like Bridgerton, because I'm not a fan. But it gets people involved and interested in the period. And if they then go and try and find out about the original period and the people and the history of that period, then it's a way of getting people interested. It's similar with the Gentleman Jack and Anne Lister. When Gentleman Jack first came out, we had a huge amount of interest in Gentleman Jack and Sir Anne Jones. Obviously, that was 2019, so it's slightly dropped down a bit in the numbers of visitors. Having that initial peak has reduced down. But what we found as that one's been going down, the interest in Anne Lister herself has been going up. And more people are interested in finding out about the real person. So you can't do that with Richard Sharp or Mr. Darcy because they're fictional. But with Anne Lister, the whole Gentleman Jack story is based on the diaries of a real person who lived in Halifax and left 5 million words in her diaries, which is more than Samuel Pepys, and is a wonderful historical record. So yeah, it's worth looking into the original people who have left these things for us.
All right, Chris, you always got a bunch of questions bursting at the seams.
Actually, I only have a couple written down, but a lot of them have been covered as we've been going through. So I've been crossing them out. But just one I'll come back to. It was way back at the beginning when you were talking about your initial ideas behind this exhibit and what you hope to do with it, and you talked about sort of providing this resource for other museums. Has that really worked out really well? Have you connected with a lot of other museums? Have you found them coming to learn from this collection?
That part of the project is still ongoing because there was like a consortium of museums that were involved in that. One was Platt Hall in Manchester, and they exhibit now through Manchester Art Gallery. So there's a gallery there that they've done. So we looked at an exhibition that they put on last year. And later this year, there's Southend Museum are doing an exhibition. And the first one was very much couture, high fashion stuff. We've done historical fashion, and the Southend Museum, they're actually doing one on drag. So completely different ends of the spectrum, really. On the so the project is taking inspiration from all of these different exhibitions that are happening, and it's still in the process of discussing what are the elements of creating exhibitions, what's the process you go through, your thought processes, how you write it down, things you have to particularly consider when doing fashion exhibitions. Costume and textile tends to be one of the more vulnerable objects in museum collections. So as I think I mentioned earlier, things like light levels always have to be considered for costume and textile, humidity. You want to reduce handling as much as possible. Security is with any exhibition, but also you then get pests that you have to think about with costume and textile collections. As any reenactor will know, if you get moths or fur beetles in your collection, it will destroy it and it'll be irreparable damage. So you do have to consider. We have got a lot of items that are on open display, partly because we've been using reproduction items, so they're a little bit more robust, and you can maybe allow the light levels to be a little bit higher. And we've got some of them on open display that allows people to be able to see them close up. We don't always like everything to be in glass cases because it can feel a little bit that there's a barrier between you and the object. So where possible, reproduction things, to have them on open display and be able to see them. So you've still got barriers so people can't walk up and just touch them and handle them. But people are generally fairly respectful of a fairly simple barrier that just stops them from walking up to it and actually putting your hands on it. And most people now are aware of the damage that does cause to museum objects. So it's all these different things to consider when putting on an exhibition. But the other thing is just how you display it, because the cost of bespoke mannequins for things to be displayed on is too high for most museums. We're a local authority museum. We haven't got loads of money. So we tend to use very basic, just the torso mannequin form, and you pad it out. Or indeed, because some of the original stuff is so small, the men's ones are generally about a 38-40, the mannequins, and the women's maybe a size 8. That's UK sizes. But the historical costume is often smaller than that, because a lot of what has survived is, from original people at the time who were much smaller. And therefore, you have to actually carve the foam figures down to be able to fit the things around them. So sometimes you are having to create a bit of a bespoke thing, but it's done in a much cheaper way than just sort of creating it from scratch. And looking at ways that you can display things, also considering the lighting and the positioning, how you put them together, what is it people want to see with things, because we've got somewhere you can actually walk all the way around them because they're in a glass case. I remember years and years ago wanting to recreate army greatcoats. And there was one at the National Army Museum that I knew was still in existence. So I made the trip down to the National Army Museum because I knew it was on display in a case. And I was particularly interested in things like the back seam. Did it have a centre back seam? Because a lot of British Army stuff, the back seam's done on the fold so that the back is just one panel. And I got there and looked at the object in the case. No matter what angle you tried, you couldn't actually see the back seam on it, and there was no mirror or reflective surface. And it was incredibly frustrating to not be able to see this back seam. So being able to see things in the round and walk around them and see them from all angles, for researchers, again, everybody's looking at things for a different reason, and it's trying to be as inclusive as possible for everybody to be able to do that. So having items that you can handle as well. Really popular thing that we get with our exhibitions is having some dress up clothing. And we had this conference of the people involved in this AHRC project come along, and they're all serious researchers and academics, and we took them up around the exhibition. They got to the dress-up clothing, and you couldn't pull them away from it. They were trying everything on, and because they would this other lot were doing the drag costume, the man from that museum was trying on all the ladies stuff as well. So, but we've got like 18th century dresses where it's all put together and it's simply like split down the back. So you put your arms through the sleeves and you tie it at the back, and then from the front you can look in the mirror and you can see the costume. People love to dress up and see how different fashions and things look on them. So and it's that selfie opportunity that you have to put into every exhibition as well. But it means people remember it and they've enjoyed it that much more. So again, it's not taking yourself too seriously all the time.
And it's free publicity for you, right? All those selfies,
Mhm.
they tag the location.
If they can hashtag Bankfield Museum or then yes, that helps to spread word of it, and yeah, it's all good.
All right, Chris, anything else on your list?
No, I just I wonder, out of curiosity though, if you've noticed, has there been a resurgence in fashion history? Did it ever really decline? Is it coming back, or is it been steady, sort of the 40 years that you've been more or less working in this field?
I have noticed in, I think, as little as the last 5 years, even just before COVID, but certainly since COVID, I think there's been a big increase in people being interested in it and in actually going and seeing original stuff and coming to museums. And partly that's partly why we did this exhibition. It was being driven by that idea. And the making community is blossoming. There are people in all sorts of periods. Reenactment, going back 30 years, tended to focus on a few basic periods. So certainly in this country, there was a lot on English Civil War, and you had Napoleonic, and you had American Civil War, and you had one or two sort of, there was some Second World War and things like that, but it wasn't so much. But over time, the number of different periods, now there's you've got Greek hoplites, you've got people doing things like the Mexican War, that in this country, and doing obscure bits of Franco-Prussian War, or all sorts of different things. So there's people specializing in their own little areas and their own things that they're particularly interested in. That's the kind of military reenactment side of it. But you've also got a huge amount of people who are now doing, it's sort of an extension of cosplay, really. And I do it myself, as I've started off doing all the military stuff. But as you get older, it's nice sometimes to not have to go out and carry 50 pounds of kit on your back and march about everywhere. And you can actually just go somewhere and look good, have a cup of tea and a piece of cake, and have a lovely day out. There's more and more people doing more and more periods, but also the internet just allows the sharing of it so much more. They can share the research, they share the photos and the days out, and that inspires people. There are groups all over the country who get together on the internet through Facebook groups and other things too. And I'm in a couple of groups, and they'll just say, we're going to go and visit this particular National Trust property on this day. If anybody wants to come along dressed in Regency period, you'll be very welcome. And you don't necessarily need to know anybody or be in a group, and it doesn't have to be the whole organized and insured setup that you get with a lot of reenactment, because all you're doing is turning up, wearing some funny clothes, and walking around a lovely historic house and taking photos. And we found that most historic sites are very welcoming of that. I think in the past people were a little bit suspicious and reticent about it. And I know that some sites, rather like Disney, would actually ban it and not allow people to go dressed in historical costume. I think the issues there were usually where it was there was a blurring of the lines of, did the people actually work there, or were they starting to give like guided tours of the site? And I know the Culloden battlefield, there was a couple used to go up there and do that, and they'd started basically doing their own battlefield tours. And National Trust for Scotland weren't happy about that, especially as they were probably spouting all the usual myths and rubbish about it. And of course, the foreign tourists think this is wonderful and all part of it, and then they're giving them tips and paying them for it. So again, that's, yeah, you can understand why some sites would ban it. But most people, you know, we always make it very clear, no, we don't work here. No, we're just for a day out. And we just, you know, people like to dress up, enjoy themselves. And but there's a lot more dancers and balls and things like that. So there's things that you can do with it. Whereas again, reenactment tended to be very male focused because it was all about the soldiers. And if women wanted to come along and do whatever women do, they'd let them. But now there's a lot more research into the women's outfits and the women's contribution. And certainly the units that I've been in are always very keen on portraying women, 50% of the population, and how much they contributed to history. History isn't all about men and what men did. And it's important to get that balance and represent everybody. The same can be said, depending on country and context, of things like history being very sort of white dominated, about, you know, this is the what the white population were doing at that particular time, and people of other ethnicities don't get represented. I think the balance and redress of that in recent years has been great to see so much more diversity, and looking at everybody's ancestors, and nobody should be made to feel ashamed of their ancestors, whatever they did, because you can't do anything about it. Yeah, you are who you are, and they did what they did, good or bad. But just, we need to look at history and accept that. But by representing it and recreating it, it's doing it in a respectful way, whilst understanding all the different stories and the different feelings that may create. Certainly, I've done things like Second World War reenactment is about as far forward as I've come. But when you actually meet up with some of the, as we used to, there aren't so many of them left now, but meeting up with the veterans, or people from who had lived through that, and the memories that would bring out with them. We've also done it and met with Holocaust survivors and things like that. I've only ever done British. There are people who do German reenactment and things, but again, there's been problems where there've been people doing like SS groups, and they often encounter difficulties, and some sites won't allow that. They will ban SS uniforms for fairly obvious reasons. Some countries don't allow it. But it is about getting that balance of history and trying to represent what it was actually like, because there's also this focus on General so-and-so did this, or the Duke of Wellington was doing that. And most people can't really relate to that. They relate to the ordinary, the private soldiers, the women that followed the army, cooks, seamstresses, you know, washers. And if you're doing something very basic and simple, like making food or washing clothes, or something very ordinary in your recreation, then people can engage with that, because we all understand food, and we understand clothing in terms of like sewing and that sort of thing. But talking about what General so-and-so did, or where this division went in a particular battle, just leaves a lot of people cold if they're not into that side of the history. So it's that ordinary, everyday stuff. Because even soldiers, they, with a lifetime in the army, you maybe spent half a dozen days of your entire career in a battle. You spent all the other days marching backwards and forwards, living, cooking your rations, eating, being transported, and just existing. And everybody likes to focus on the battles and the action and the shooting. But it's representing ordinary life, and you know that these were our ancestors and people in history, and this is what they did. So yeah.
Well, to support that, one of our favorite events, Fort Erie. So Fort Erie is operated by the Niagara Parks Commission. So they kind of poll their audience extensively, like survey and that, and ask them what they enjoy the most of the siege weekend. Is it the battle scenarios, blowing the fort up, the candlelight tours, the museum, and then generally speaking, what is polls the strongest is just walking through the encampments and then watching the reenactors replicating the day-to-day life. The followers cooking meals, guys cleaning their muskets, or even just seeking out shade and napping under a tree. Like they find all that stuff fascinating. So, if I can, I got one last question. It's kind of a silly one, but there's a purpose behind it because 2015 we went to New Orleans and they had a uniform coat there that was from General Jackson, who went on to become a president of the United States. So he was, I believe, a very tall man, 6'4", 6'5", but I was stunned at how small the coat was. And then so you mentioned you got the Duke of Wellington's coat, and then
Yes.
I have no idea what his real life height was. I'm going by film depictions. I'm
I
assuming.
think he was about 5'9".
Okay, so yeah, I got this vision of him being taller. So to see his coat, is it surprisingly small, like in a modern?
From recollection, without going back and measuring it, I believe it was about a 38 chest. Yes, it's not huge, and certainly at that time he wasn't a large man. Some people obviously get larger as they get older. It happens to a lot of us. But I think the Duke, looking at the images of him, generally remained at a similar sort of size. But yeah, certainly at that one he was, and similarly his boots aren't particularly a large size. I think they'd probably maybe be a 7 or 8 UK size. So no, it was fairly average for the time. I mean, I think 5'9" might be the average. It was about 5'7". I think he was about 5'8", 5'9". So he's just a little bit taller than average, but not. He wasn't tall particularly, from what I can gather. So,
all right. Well, thanks.
yeah, it is interesting looking at how sizes and shapes change. And that certainly is a challenge with a lot of reenactors, as we do tend to be a lot better fed these days, and we don't march 12 miles a day with 50 pounds on our back. I've tried it, and I used to think that I'd last a week. I now know that I would last about 2 days. So having tried it, it's at the end of doing what they did on a daily basis, you're absolutely wrecked because we're not used to it.
Yeah, that was their daily routine. Like I look at the garrison troops here and say, all right, you're going from we're gonna move you from Fort George to the barracks at Queenston. And it's just like, all right, that's 14 kilometers, right? And then that's, yeah, okay, well, knock that off, and then we got a full day of work, afterwards, and that's just routine for them, right? So
it's when you think of the campaigns like the Waterloo campaign that, yes, they were shipped over to the Low Countries, but then they walked to Waterloo, and after Waterloo they walked to Paris.
well, I was thinking even the lead up, a lot of them walked to Quatre Bras and then back.
And back again. Yes, I've done that march. And yeah, that one, without the entire French army on your back trying to kill you, was enough of a challenge. So yes, it's incomprehensible what they actually went through and just how tired they must have been by the end of it. And also just, at Quatre Bras, the 33rd, they lost 100 men out of 561, I think it was. There was about 100 either killed, wounded, or missing, because quite a few were captured at Quatre Bras. But to be experiencing that, and then having to do your march and continue to exist and then fight another battle 2 days later. It's yes, you when you do it, you have nothing but respect for the original people who went through that and achieved what they did. And then after that, as I said, all the way to Paris, there was no transport. The only way they were going to get there was to march and to walk there. So, and that's pretty much everybody. Okay, cavalry and some of the officers and the occasional carriage, but most people, including the infantry officers, were walking all the way. So they were tough cookies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording. We've could talk for hours more, but we got to saw this off somewhere along the way. So thank you very much, Richard. In the comments, as I post this to YouTube, I'll put links to the museums and people can learn more about your collections and offerings and how to find you. And I know just in talking to you, then I can see the wheels spinning in Chris that he's planning a visit to Halifax.
He wants to see the shirt, doesn't he? That's what it is.
Not the shirt. I think you turn him loose in your collection, he might be there for a week. So checking out.
Well, you'd be very welcome. Yes.
Well, we look forward to it. So thank you very much.